Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on the legalisation of weed. Weed is a drug that contains THC. This ingredient stimulates the release of the pleasure hormone dopamine, which is the high of taking the drug. Weed can also have other effects, such as decreased reaction times and distorted senses. Politicians and society as a whole are divided on whether weed is a harmless recreational drug in small quantities, or whether it's bad and should be outright banned. Today, we will unpick and compare these opinions. Perhaps the most commonly advocated reason to legalise weed is that it is not nearly as harmful as some people say. Not only does weed avoid many common side effects of other drugs, such as cocaine and heroin, but it has also been proven to have medical benefits, such as, for example, preventing epilepsy, and, of course, medical marijuana. Weed, therefore, is not nearly as harmful to some as, for example, tobacco and alcohol, and as such to keep it banned while the others are legalised is wrong. Some people believe that the usage of weed is not harmful to wider society. Done in the privacy of your own home, there is no external cost to taking the drug, and in public it isn't as bad as, for example, passive smoking or very drunk people. Another reason to legalise weed is that we live in a time of individual freedom. Some people argue that the government should not tell people what they can and can't do with their own time and in their own home. In the world of individual responsibility, some argue it is up to each person to decide what they themselves want to do. There is also an economic incentive to legalise weed. Doing so would allow the government to raise money through taxes like tobacco and alcohol taxes. Weed taxes would allow more tax revenue, which has knock-on effects, for example, more money to spend on whatever the government spends its money on. There would also be benefits in job creation. Weed production centres would be set up, creating jobs in the manufacture and distribution of the drug. What we see here are benefits economically to legalising weed, and there is also the added benefit, if you will, of reducing costs. For example, the government would have to spend less money on policing, prisons and rehabilitation, which all provide an economic benefit. Some also argue that legalising weed would be beneficial for users, because it would result in only good quality, standards approved weed from being consumed. Like how alcohol and cigarettes have to be of a certain quality, legalising it would allow the government to ensure the quality of weed consumed is good. And finally, some argue that legalising weed would be beneficial, for it would cut a crucial revenue stream for organised crime and other criminal gangs. If the government or free market controls the distribution of weed, then there would simply be less drug dealers because there are less drugs to sell. This would cut income for the criminals, as well as reduce the number of victims, mainly children, who are groomed into joining criminal gangs. Although some advocate that weed is not bad for you, others would disagree. Medical weed comes in controlled doses, but recreational use does not. Weed has been linked to heart and lung problems as well as mental health issues. And furthermore, just because tobacco and alcohol are legalised doesn't mean we also should legalise another potentially harmful drug. Some people believe these negative effects will be carried out into society. Drug driving might become an even more prevalent issue, just as drink driving is. Social order might decline with lots of high people walking around, and this is something that many people may not want in their communities. Some also argue that the government does have the right to ban weed because it has wider impacts. Some people may not want to live in a society surrounded by junkies, and so if most of the population or in an area supports banning the drug, it should be banned. Although weed may provide revenue from taxes, it could also be harmful economically. The government would likely have to spend more money on helping drug users overcome addictions alongside health risks of increased usage. Furthermore, drug users would have to spend more on the drug given there is now a tax on it. Given that they were taking the drug before it was legalised, they will continue to do so, and as such the financial stability of many drug users could worsen even more. An unintended consequence of legalising weed is also that it could lead to higher levels of addiction. 1 in 10 people develop dependencies on weed, and this may result with more users, therefore more addicts. Furthermore, children will likely be exposed to the drug from a younger age, meaning there is a greater risk to their well-being as they grow up. And a final argument opposed to legalising weed is that it could push organised crime to more extreme measures. Weed is a somewhat innocent drug compared to, for example, cocaine and heroin, and if they cannot sell weed, then criminals may push more people to take the more extreme drugs and may get involved in other areas of criminal activity. Furthermore, there is a general feeling to some that the impact to organised crime is not a sufficient enough argument to justify all the negative effects of legalising weed. Moving on now to the comparison. Firstly, on the question of how bad is weed. Well, those supporting its legalisation would advocate that it isn't really that bad for you. There can be health benefits associated with weed. They may argue, for example, it isn't addictive, and it is not as bad as other drugs such as tobacco and alcohol. Those disagreeing with this viewpoint, however, say that it can be bad for you. It can be bad for your physical health. If you take drugs a lot, it's always going to be bad for you, and it can also be bad for your mental health. Furthermore, some would say that just because other drugs, for example tobacco and alcohol, are worse than weed, it doesn't make the legalisation of weed good. You're simply adding another minorly harmful drug to the legalised pool. On the question of what is the impact on society, well, those advocating the legalisation of weed argue that when it's done privately, it isn't a problem. Whatever you do in your own home won't affect other people. They may also say that there is a limited impact to taking weed compared to, for example, alcohol and tobacco. As always though, there are those who disagree, and they would point to the unintended consequences of the legalisation of weed, for example, increases in drug driving. And they may also say that drug use is almost always negative for societies, and it's hard to find the case where it's actually beneficial. On this question of can the government actually ban weed? Well, those supporting the legalisation say they shouldn't. They say it's an individual right people possess whether or not they want to take it. And in the age of self-accountability, people should be able to choose for themselves whether or not they want to take a drug. Those disagreeing, however, argue that the government has a responsibility to maintain social cohesion. If people don't want drugs in their societies, governments should fulfill that wish. On this question of the economic impact of legalisation, well, those supporting it argue that there are benefits economically. First of all, there is more tax revenue generated from taxing weed sold legally. There are more jobs created in this new business, the legal business at least, that you have created. And there is also lower expenditure on policing and prisons, all of which are beneficial to the economy. However, those disagreeing argue, firstly, that more money will be spent on regulations and helping addicts recover, and there is a higher cost for users, which will result in more financial problems. On this question of what would legalising weed actually do to the usage of it, well, those supporting the legalisation argue that it would only ensure good quality weed is consumed. It reduces the likelihood of taking poor quality products, and that is a beneficial thing. However, those disagreeing would say that you may, for example, find higher levels of addiction because weed is now far more accessible. If you can buy it from your local co-op corner shop, it's going to be easier than having to meet some dodgy looking dude in a Vauxhall Corsa. Nothing against Vauxhall Corsas, by the way. There are also those who argue that there is a risk to children becoming exposed to the drug at a much earlier age, and this can cause problems with addiction and usage when they grow up. Finally, on this question of how does it impact organised crime, for those supporting the legalisation of weed, They would argue that you cut a vital revenue stream for criminal gangs, which means there will be less drug dealers and gangs will have less resources. Furthermore, it is likely that less children will be roped into becoming drug dealers for these gangs. Those disagreeing, however, say that criminals may turn to more extreme drugs and become even worse in many areas if you're forcing them to act. And they would also say that any benefit to organised crime would not negate the negative effects associated with legalising weed, in their opinion. Overall then, those who support the legalisation of weed point to the benefits of legalising it on quality and the economy, and would suggest weed is not that harmful of a drug. They would say an individual themselves has the right to decide whether they want to take it, and not the government. Those opposing the legalisation of weed, however, believe it is a harmful drug to both individuals and society, and that there would be unintended consequences of legalising it. The question of whether or not weed should become legal will depend mainly upon voter demographics. As younger and generally more liberal voters become the dominant bloc, it is likely weed will become legal in more places over time. Ultimately though, what do you think? Do you believe weed should or should not be legal? And do you think weed is as bad as some people say, or merely an innocent recreational drug? And from my point of view, is there anything I missed, got wrong, or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. As always, the aim of this episode has been not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. Be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.